Real nightmares.
The sun hung low over the dense pines, casting long shadows across the dirt road as Jamie stared out the bus window. The sight of the familiar lake just beyond the trees should have brought comfort, but instead, Jamie's stomach twisted. Why did I come back? Jamie wondered. Tara had been so excited about returning to Camp Pinehaven, and in a moment of weakness, Jamie had agreed to join her for another summer. But now, surrounded by the buzz of excited campers, Jamie felt the first twinges of regret. They stepped off the bus, squinting as the setting sun painted the camp in warm orange hues. The cabins stood in their familiar rows, and the towering trees stretched up like silent sentinels. Everything looked the same, but there was something different in the air this year. Something Jamie couldn't quite place. "Come on, Slowpoke," Tara called, her voice light and carefree. She jogged up to Jamie, nudging her friend's arm. "We've got to grab the best bunks." Jamie forced a smile, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just nerves, nothing more than the familiar anxiety that had followed Jamie for years. But the feeling wouldn't lift, not even as they settled into the main lodge that evening for the welcome bonfire. The counselors were lively, cracking jokes, setting up esmores, and introducing themselves to the campers. It almost felt normal. Almost. As the last of the counselors arrived, a hush fell over the group. A figure stood just outside the fire's light, dressed in the same uniform as the others, but something was different. They wore a full mask, plain and featureless. The firelight reflected eerily off its smooth surface. "Who's that?" Jamie whispered to Tara. "Probably just a prank," Tara replied, shrugging. But Jamie couldn't take her eyes off the figure. The mask never moved, and no explanation came. Later that night, as Jamie lay in the dark cabin, the earlier sense of unease returned. Tara was already asleep in the bunk above, breathing softly in the warm night air. Jamie tossed and turned, eyes drifting to the open window where a faint breeze stirred the curtains. Everything was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Then, Jamie saw it. Just beyond the window, barely visible in the moonlight, stood the masked counselor. The same featureless mask, glowing faintly in the dark, stared directly into the cabin. A chill ran through Jamie's body as they froze, unsure whether to blink or call for help. The figure remained perfectly still, like a statue, watching, waiting. Jamie's heart pounded in their chest as they squeezed their eyes shut, hoping it was just a nightmare. When they opened them again, the figure was gone. The next morning, as the campers gathered for breakfast, Jamie couldn't shake the memory of the masked figure outside the window. Tara sat across the table, talking animatedly about the day's activities, but Jamie could barely hear her. "Are you okay?" Tara asked, leaning in. "You look like you didn't sleep." Jamie hesitated. "I saw that masked counselor last night. They were standing outside our cabin, just watching." Tara snorted, taking a bite of her toast. "You're imagining things. It's probably just part of the camp scare tactics. You know how they like to prank the new kids." "I don't know," Jamie muttered, feeling that same unease creeping in. It didn't feel like a joke. Just then, a low murmur spread through the dining hall. A group of counselors stood huddled in the corner, talking in hushed tones. One of the younger kids was missing. Jamie strained to hear more, but all they caught was the mention of a name. Someone from Cabin 3. No one had seen them since last night. The head counselor quickly reassured everyone that they were probably just exploring, but Jamie wasn't so sure. The growing sense of dread made it hard to breathe. Tara, however, seemed unfazed. "You worry too much," Tara said. "They'll turn up. It's probably nothing." But Jamie's mind raced back to the shadowy figure outside their window, standing like a silent sentinel in the night. It wasn't nothing. Jamie was sure of it. Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the day wore on, they kept glancing around camp, half expecting the masked counselor to appear at any moment. Tara had moved on, chatting with other campers, but Jamie's focus remained fixed on the mystery lurking beneath the surface. After lunch, Jamie decided to ask around. Maybe someone else had seen the masked counselor or heard something strange about them. Approaching the camp's longtime cook, Mrs. Nettles, seemed like a good start. Mrs. Nettles had been at Camp Pinehaven for as long as anyone could remember, always with a knowing smile and a quiet way of observing everything. Jamie found her alone by the kitchen, peeling potatoes for dinner. "Mrs. Nettles?" Jamie hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" The cook looked up, her weathered hands pausing mid-motion. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" Jamie glanced over their shoulder, lowering their voice. "Have you noticed anything strange about one of the counselors? The one who wears the mask?" Mrs. Nettles' eyes darkened slightly, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the knife down and wiped her hands on her apron. "You're not the first to ask about that mask," she said quietly, "but some questions are better left unanswered." Jamie's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The older woman leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, before you were born, a counselor disappeared from this camp. Nobody ever figured out what happened to him, but some say he was wearing a mask, just like the one you're talking about. Ever since then," she trailed off, her eyes shifting to the forest line, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the trees. Jamie's heart raced, but Mrs. Nettles offered no more. With a tight-lipped smile, she returned to her potatoes. "That's all I'll say. You keep your head down and don't go poking around where you don't belong." But Jamie couldn't let it go. That night, after lights out, they waited until the camp was quiet before slipping out of the cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth as Jamie made their way toward the counselors' cabins, heart pounding. The masked counselor's cabin was at the far edge of camp, nestled near the dark tree lane. With trembling hands, Jamie pushed open the door, half expecting to see the masked figure waiting inside. Instead, the cabin was empty, lit only by a dim lamp on the bedside table. Jamie moved quickly, rifling through drawers and shelves. That's when they found it. A stack of old photos, yellowed and worn with time. One photo in particular caught Jamie's eye. A group of counselors standing together, arms slung over each other's shoulders, all smiling, except one. In the center of the group stood a figure wearing the same mask. Jamie's stomach lurched. Underneath the photos was an old newspaper clipping, brittle with age. The headline read, "Counselor vanishes at Camp Pinehaven. Missing, presumed dead." Before Jamie could process it, the door creaked behind them. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Jamie spun around, heart hammering, but the doorway was empty. The next day, the tension around camp grew palpable. More whispers spread about missing campers, but the counselors seemed unfazed, reassuring everyone that it was nothing more than kids wandering off. Jamie knew better. The masked counselor's presence lingered like a shadow over the camp, and no one else seemed to notice. It happened again that night. Jamie awoke to a soft rustling outside the cabin window. Barely daring to breathe, they peered out and saw the masked figure standing by the tree line, this time not alone. The counselor was leading one of the younger campers into the woods, one of the very kids who hadn't shown up for dinner. Panic surged through Jamie as they watched the camper walk obediently beside the faceless counselor. For a brief moment, Jamie considered running after them, but fear rooted them to the spot. Instead, they lay frozen, watching until the figures disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, that camper was missing. No one seemed to connect the dots except Jamie, who felt the dread creeping deeper with every passing moment. "I saw it," Jamie said, voice shaking as they cornered Tara by the mess hall. "I saw the masked counselor taking that kid last night. They're the reason campers are disappearing," Tara sighed, rubbing her temples as if this was all too much to handle. "Jamie, I think you need to calm down. You're letting this place get to you." "Calm down?" Jamie's voice cracked with disbelief. "You don't believe me? I saw them with my own eyes. The mask, it's connected to something from the past. Mrs. Nettles told me about a counselor who disappeared years ago, and now it's happening again." Tara shook her head, her patience wearing thin. "It's probably just some stupid camp tradition to scare the new kids. You're overthinking it. There's nothing going on." Jamie's frustration boiled over. "How can you say that? Kids are missing, and you're acting like it's no big deal. What if you're next? What if I'm next?" Tara's expression hardened, a wall going up between them. "You need to stop, Jamie. You're freaking everyone out." The words stung, and Jamie took a step back, feeling more alone than ever. Tara turned away, leaving Jamie standing there, heart pounding, fists clenched in frustration. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the camp, Jamie realized they were truly alone in this. No one would listen. No one would believe. And that's when the real fear began to settle in, because now it was only a matter of time before the masked counselor returned. That night, Jamie couldn't sleep. Tara's words echoed in their mind, but no matter how hard they tried to shake it off, the dread kept gnawing at them. Something terrible was happening at Camp Pinehaven, and Jamie was the only one who saw it. As midnight approached, Jamie made a decision. If no one else believed them, they'd have to figure it out alone. Quietly slipping out of the cabin, Jamie crept toward the edge of camp, where the forest loomed like a wall of shadows. The masked counselor always led the missing campers into the woods. That's where the truth would be found. The night was still, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the trees. Jamie's heart pounded in their chest as they followed the narrow, overgrown path that snaked deeper into the forest. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the trees themselves were watching. And then they saw it. In a small clearing, bathed in moonlight, the masked counselor stood with a group of campers. But something was terribly wrong. The campers were standing still, too still, their eyes vacant, faces expressionless. They moved only when the counselor gestured, like puppets on invisible strings. Jamie's breath caught in their throat as they realized the campers weren't in control of their own bodies. The counselor lifted their hands, beginning some kind of ritual. A low chant echoed through the woods, sending chills down Jamie's spine. It was as if the air itself thickened with darkness, swirling around the clearing, drawing the life from the campers. Jamie's eyes darted to the counselor, whose hands reached up to the mask. With a slow, deliberate motion, the counselor pulled the mask from their face, and beneath it, there was nothing. A hollow, faceless void stared back, darker than the night itself, as if the figure had no soul. Jamie stifled a scream, backing up against a tree as the horrifying truth sank in. This wasn't a prank. The counselor wasn't human. They were something far older and far worse, an ancient spirit feeding off the camper's life force. The mask was the key to its power, a cursed object that allowed it to remain tied to this world. And with each camper it took, the creature grew stronger. Jamie's mind raced. They had to stop this. If they didn't, Tara would be next. Everyone would be next. The only way to break the curse was to destroy the mask. Jamie's pulse raced as they darted behind the trees, heart thudding in their ears. The faceless counselor continued the ritual, the campers standing still like hollow shells, drained of life. Jamie knew they couldn't wait any longer. If they didn't act now, those campers, Tara included, would be lost forever. Gathering every ounce of courage, Jamie crept closer to the clearing, eyes fixed on the mask. It rested on a small stone altar near the counselor, gleaming under the moonlight. If Jamie could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, it would end the nightmare. But as they took a step forward, a twig snapped beneath their foot. The counselor's head jerked in Jamie's direction, and the campers, as if sensing the disturbance, turned their blank faces toward the noise. The counselor raised a hand, and the campers began moving, their bodies jerking unnaturally, closing in on Jamie. Panic surged, but Jamie forced themselves to stay focused. They bolted toward the altar, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The campers, slow but relentless, staggered after Jamie, blocking the path. Desperation set in as Jamie dodged past them, heart pounding, feet slipping on the damp forest floor. Just as Jamie reached the altar, the counselor loomed behind them, hand outstretched. With a cry, Jamie grabbed the mask, its surface unnaturally cold to the touch, and swung it with all their strength against the stone altar. The mask shattered with a deafening crack, splintering into shards. A guttural scream tore through the night as the counselor recoiled, its form dissolving into a dark, twisting mist. The campers collapsed to the ground like marionettes with their strings cut, motionless but breathing. For a moment, everything was still. The woods were eerily silent, save for Jamie's ragged breaths. It was over. The mask was destroyed. The counselor's curse, broken. The camp was eerily quiet the next morning. The once lively chatter of campers was now replaced by a subdued, haunted atmosphere. Most of them had no memory of what had happened in the woods. They just felt drained, weak, but alive. Jamie sat by the edge of the lake, staring at the rippling water, trying to make sense of everything. Tara sat beside them, rubbing her temples, still groggy from the night before. She couldn't remember anything after the campfire. When Jamie had tried to explain, Tara had just stared, wide-eyed, unable to comprehend it all. "Do you think it's really over?" Tara finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jamie glanced at her, then back at the water. "I don't know," they admitted, their minds still racing with the memories of the faceless counselor and the mask that had held so much power. The mask was gone, and with it, the counselor's curse, or so Jamie hoped. As the campers prepared to leave later that afternoon, the buses lined up at the front of the camp. Everyone was moving more slowly, as if still trying to shake off the fog of what had happened. Jamie felt the weight of the past few days in their bones, the trauma lingering like a shadow. Just as Jamie turned aboard the bus, something caught their eye. Across the lake, near the tree line, a new figure stood. They wore a mask, not the same plain one from before, but a different, eerily similar mask. This one slightly cracked, as if it had been hastily pieced back together. Jamie's breath caught in their throat, fear trickling down their spine. The figure raised a hand slowly, in a gesture that almost felt like a wave. It wasn't over. The camp was exactly as Emily imagined, old and forgotten, like a place time had left behind. The cabins were worn, the paint peeling off their wooden frames, and the lake that stretched just beyond the treeline glistened ominously in the fading light. The dense forest surrounding the camp only added to the isolation, making her feel like the outside world was a distant memory. Emily shuffled her bag onto her shoulder as she approached her assigned cabin. Inside, 3 other campers were already unpacking. Sarah, with her friendly smile, introduced herself first, her voice bright and welcoming. Matt barely glanced up, more interested in his phone, while Jessica stood quietly by her bunk, watching everything with a cautious eye. Emily found her own bunk near the door, its sheets neatly folded in place. As she sat down, she felt the weight of the camp's atmosphere settle on her shoulders. There was something unsettling about the air here, a stillness that seemed too quiet. That night, after the campfire, Sarah decided to break the silence in the cabin with a story. "Have you guys heard about the unseen camper?" she asked, her voice lowering with mock seriousness. "They say that years ago, a camper vanished, but his bed was always made, his stuff always in place. People say his ghost still takes up one of the bunks, though no one ever sees him." Emily tried to smile along with the others, but the unease crept up her spine. Something about the way Sarah told the story, the way the camp's shadows seemed to move outside the window, made her stomach twist. As the lights went out, the thought lingered in her mind. Was she really alone in the cabin? The cabin was eerily quiet once the lights were out, the kind of silence that pressed against Emily's ears and made her heart pound louder than usual. She lay in her bunk, eyes closed, trying to drift off, but something about the place wouldn't let her relax. The distant hoot of an owl was the only sound punctuating the stillness of the night. Then she heard it. At first, it was faint, so soft that she thought it might be her imagination, but the sound persisted, growing clearer. It was sobbing, unmistakably close. Emily sat up, her pulse quickening. She glanced around the dark room, barely able to make out the shapes of the others in their bunks. Sarah, Matt, and Jessica were all asleep, their breathing deep and even. The sobbing continued, low and heart-wrenching, but no one else stirred. Emily's gaze shifted to the empty bunk near the back of the cabin, the one no one had claimed. The sound seemed to come from that direction. Cold air brushed her skin, and she pulled her blanket tighter, unsure of what to do. After what felt like hours, the crying stopped abruptly. The sudden silence made the air feel heavier, and Emily stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the empty bed, watching for any movement. Morning came with the first rays of sunlight slipping through the cracks in the old cabin's walls. Emily rubbed her eyes, her body stiff from a restless night. As she looked over at the empty bunk, a shiver ran through her. The sheets were crumpled, as if someone had slept there. She wasn't sure whether to say anything, but the unease that gnawed at her stomach refused to fade. The next few days passed in a blur of activities, but the unease stayed with Emily. Every night, she lay awake, waiting for the sobbing to return. It didn't, but the disturbed bunk remained, its sheets wrinkled, as if someone invisible occupied it each night. Sarah continued to shrug it off as a joke, while Matt dismissed Emily's concerns with a roll of his eyes. Jessica, however, stayed silent, her eyes betraying a quiet fear that mirrored Emily's own. By the fourth day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air in the cabin felt oppressive, almost suffocating, and she swore she could feel a presence in the room, watching her. When she found her flashlight moved from under her pillow to the empty bunk, her unease grew into full-fledged dread. She had to find out what was going on. That evening, while the others were distracted at dinner, Emily slipped away. She had overheard a counselor mention an old storage room in the camp's administration building where records were kept. Maybe, she thought, she could find something, anything, that explained the strange occurrences. The storage room was dark and dusty, filled with old rosters, schedules, and forgotten camp memorabilia. Emily sifted through the piles of papers until she found a stack of camper rosters from previous summers. Her heart raced as she scanned through them, her fingers trembling slightly. Then she saw it. Each year, the roster for her cabin had one extra name, Carter. He was always listed last, and no one else seemed to remember him. The dates stretched back at least 10 years, and every summer, without fail, Carter was listed. But there were no notes beside his name, no indication he had ever arrived or left. He simply existed, a ghost in the camp's history. When Emily returned to the cabin that night, she told Sarah, Matt, and Jessica about what she had found. Matt rolled his eyes. "There's no such thing as ghosts," he said, annoyed. But Sarah looked uneasy, and Jessica stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the empty bunk. That night, the air in the cabin seemed thicker, heavier. Emily's discovery had unsettled them all, even if Matt refused to admit it. As the lights flickered out and they settled into their bunks, Emily felt a knot of tension in her chest. The cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. Charged, expectant, something was coming. Around midnight, it began. The bunk nearest the window creaked. At first, it was a soft sound, like the gentle shifting of weight, but it grew louder, more insistent, as if someone, or something, was moving across the old wooden frame. Emily lay frozen in her bed, her eyes wide in the darkness. She could hear Matt's breathing quicken, even though he had been the most skeptical. Then, without warning, the temperature plummeted. Cold air swept through the cabin, and the faint sound of sobbing returned, much clearer than before. This time, it wasn't distant or muffled. It was right there, echoing from the empty bunk. Emily's heart raced as she pulled the covers tightly around her, praying it would stop. Jessica whimpered from the top bunk, and Sarah whispered frantically, "What's going on? Who's doing this?" Suddenly, a loud bang shook the cabin, as though something heavy had been thrown against the wall. Matt shot up, his bravado gone, panic in his voice. "This isn't funny anymore," he shouted. "Stop it." But no one was moving. Emily looked around, and her blood ran cold as she realized the sound wasn't coming from any of them. Something was inside the cabin with them. The door rattled on its hinges, as if someone was trying to force it open. Then, a shadowy figure flickered at the edge of Emily's vision, standing near the empty bunk. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness, but it was there. A boy, small, hunched, and utterly still. Jessica gasped. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the shadow disappeared, vanishing into thin air as if it had never been there. The sobbing stopped, and the room fell silent again. But the feeling of dread lingered. Emily's eyes landed on the bunk, Carter's bunk. They were no longer alone. The next day, no one could ignore the fear that gripped them. Matt barely spoke, his usual bravado replaced with an uneasy silence. Sarah had become more serious, no longer brushing off the strange occurrences. And Jessica, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, couldn't seem to stop glancing at Carter's empty bunk. Emily knew they had to do something. She had read about spirits, how some linger because they want recognition or closure. Maybe that's all Carter needed, someone to acknowledge him. We should try to talk to him, she suggested hesitantly that evening. Matt scoffed, though his voice shook. Talk to a ghost? Are you serious? I think it's the only way, Emily insisted. He wants us to see him, to know he's here. If we do, maybe he'll leave us alone. Reluctantly, the others agreed. That night, they gathered around Carter's bunk. Emily had brought a few candles she had borrowed from the mess hall, and as she lit them, the flickering flames cast long, wavering shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. The air was thick with tension, each of them barely breathing as they sat in a circle. Emily closed her eyes and in a quiet voice called out, "Carter, if you're here, we want to talk to you. We know you've been alone for a long time. We see you." The room's temperature dropped instantly, the cold biting at their skin. The flames of the candles wavered violently, as if blown by an invisible wind. A low, guttural sob echoed from the far corner of the cabin, growing louder and more desperate. Then, from the shadows, he appeared. At first, it was just a faint outline, but as they stared, the shape became more defined. A young boy, standing beside the bunk, his face obscured by darkness. His presence filled the room with a sense of unbearable sorrow and anger. His eyes seemed to bore into them, accusing, demanding. "I was forgotten," his voice rasped, filled with pain. "Why?" The boy's figure flickered in the candlelight, his voice filled with bitterness. "You left me all alone." His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto Emily, the accusation clear in his gaze. Sarah's breath hitched, and Matt shuffled backward, his face pale with terror. "We didn't forget you," Sarah blurted, her voice shaking. We didn't even know you were here." But Carter wasn't listening. His figure grew sharper, more defined, as the air in the cabin thickened. His sorrow twisted into something darker, anger. "I was here every summer," he hissed, "and none of you saw me. None of you cared." Emily's mind raced. She had thought Carter just wanted recognition, but now, standing face to face with the ghost, she realized they had misunderstood. Carter's pain had festered over the years, warping into something far more dangerous. He wasn't just looking for acknowledgement, he wanted retribution. "I don't want your apologies," Carter growled. "I want one of you to stay." The cabin seemed to groan under the weight of his words. The doors slammed shut, and the windows rattled, trapping them inside. Panic washed over Emily as the realization dawned. Carter wasn't going to let them leave unless one of them remained behind, bound to his loneliness forever. Matt tried to get up, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. "No, this isn't happening," he shouted, his voice breaking. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but something shifted inside her. She recognized Carter's pain, the same deep-rooted feeling of abandonment she had carried with her all summer. Her family had drifted away after her father's death, leaving her to feel invisible, just like Carter. She stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Carter, I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one cares." She met his gaze, tears stinging her eyes. "But trapping us won't fix it. It'll just keep you alone." For a moment, Carter's form wavered, the anger in his eyes dimming. The wind died down, and the oppressive air lightened. For a long moment, the cabin was deathly still. Emily held her breath, watching as Carter's figure flickered, torn between his anger and the words that had reached him. His expression softened slightly, the rage that had fueled his haunting fading into something closer to sorrow. His body, once sharp and menacing, seemed to blur at the edges, his form growing weaker. "I don't want to be alone anymore," Carter whispered, his voice small, almost like a child's again. Emily took a cautious step forward, her voice steady but filled with empathy. "You don't have to be alone, but holding us here will only keep you trapped. We see you now, Carter. We won't forget you." For the first time, Carter looked uncertain. His hollow eyes flicked toward the other campers, who were watching in stunned silence. Slowly, the tension in the room began to lift, and the icy chill dissipated. The figure of the boy seemed to dissolve into the shadows, the haunting sobs fading away with him. The door creaked open on its own, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the cabin for so long finally lifted. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Matt scrambled to his feet, shaking his head in disbelief, while Sarah and Jessica exchanged glances, too stunned to speak. They had survived, but the experience had marked them all deeply. As they packed their things the next morning, preparing to leave the camp earlier than planned, Emily glanced back at the cabin one last time. For just a second, she thought she saw a faint figure standing in the window, a boy's silhouette watching them leave. The door to the cabin swung slightly, as if bidding them farewell, or perhaps inviting the next campers inside. The sun hung low over the treeline as Eli stepped out of the car and took in his surroundings. Camp Clearwater was exactly how he remembered it. Sprawling fields, rustic cabins, and the lake, perfectly still and shimmering under the golden light. It was his first summer as a counselor, and though the camp looked inviting, something about the lake made his stomach churn. He shoved the feeling down, determined to make this summer different. Jack bounded over from the main lodge, his face lighting up in a grin. "Eli, you made it." He slapped Eli on the back, the same carefree energy that had gotten them through college still radiating from him. "Wouldn't miss it," Eli replied, masking the unease that had settled in his chest since he saw the lake. This summer was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to move past everything. Maybe Camp Clearwater could help him forget about his brother, about the water that had taken him. Mia, the head counselor, stood on the porch of the lodge, clipboard in hand. "Glad you're here, Eli," she said warmly. "Welcome to the team. We're going to have a great summer." As she briefed the group of counselors, her voice blended into the background. Eli's attention drifted back to the lake, reflecting the fading light in long, wavering ripples. "You know the old legend, right?" Mia asked the group, breaking Eli's thoughts. "About the lake? The one where anyone who swims too far disappears." She laughed, but Eli could hear the faintest trace of tension in her voice. "Yeah, they call it the lake that takes," Jack chimed in, grinning. "It's just a story to scare the campers." But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. The camp settled into its routine over the next couple of days. The sounds of laughter, games, and crackling campfires filled the air, masking any underlying tension. Eli tried to focus on his duties, leading his group of campers in activities, but his mind kept drifting back to the lake. Every time he passed it, he felt its presence lingering, as if it were watching him. That night, after lights out, a counselor burst into the lodge, breathless and pale. "Ben's gone," she gasped. "One of the campers, he's missing." Panic spread through the camp. Eli joined the search party, combing through the woods and checking the cabins, but there was no sign of Ben. A few campers claimed they'd seen him sneaking down to the lake after dark, daring himself to swim out farther than anyone else had. But when the search team reached the shore, all they found were his shoes and a towel, abandoned on the rocks. "He's probably run off," Jack said, though his voice wavered. "Kids get spooked and hide out sometimes. We'll find him in the morning." But Eli wasn't so sure. Standing at the edge of the water, staring into the endless blackness, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The calm surface seemed to mock them, as if it had swallowed Ben whole and left nothing behind. The mood around camp shifted after Ben's disappearance. What had once been a place of laughter and adventure was now filled with nervous whispers and uneasy glances toward the lake. Days passed, but there was still no trace of Ben. Search efforts continued, but deep down, everyone knew he wasn't coming back. Eli tried to shake the unease, but it clung to him like the fog that now rolled over the lake every morning. Campers began reporting strange dreams, all eerily similar. Voices calling to them from the water, shadowy figures swimming beneath the surface. Sarah, a quiet but sharp-eyed camper, approached Eli after lunch one day. "I saw something last night," she whispered, glancing nervously around. "By the lake." There was a hand. No, a shadow, I think, reaching up from the water. Eli's skin prickled. Are you sure? Sarah nodded. It was dark, but I know what I saw. Eli's heart pounded. It wasn't just Sarah. Other campers spoke of feeling drawn to the lake, like something was calling them. Jack, who'd been joking about Ben's disappearance days earlier, now refused to go near the water. Maybe it's all in their heads, Jack muttered one evening. You know how kids are. One spooky story, and suddenly everyone's seeing things. But Eli wasn't so sure. Every time he looked at the lake, it felt like it was waiting for its next victim. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong with the lake. The eerie dreams, Sarah's sighting, and Jack's sudden reluctance to go near the water. It all pointed to something more than just a tragic accident. Desperate for answers, Eli began digging into the camp's past. One evening, after the campers had gone to bed, Eli snuck into the camp's small library. Dusty old records, forgotten by time, lined the shelves. It took hours, but eventually, he found what he was looking for. A faded journal belonging to a former counselor from the 1980s. The entries started off innocently enough, descriptions of typical camp life. But as Eli flipped further, the tone grew darker. There were mentions of strange sightings near the lake, shadows in the water, and campers complaining of nightmares about drowning. One particular entry made Eli's blood run cold. Another one is gone. They say he drowned, but I know better. The lake takes them. It calls to them, and once they're in, it never lets go. Eli's heart raced as he read through more accounts of disappearances over the years. Each time, the pattern was the same. Campers drawn to the water, swimmers disappearing without a trace, and the camp staff quietly covering it up. The last entry in the journal was abrupt, almost frantic. I'm leaving. The lake wants more, and I won't be next. Eli's hands trembled as he closed the journal. The lake wasn't just a place. It was something alive, something hungry. He needed to warn the others, but who would believe him? Mia certainly wouldn't, and Jack, well, Jack was still in denial. Only Sarah seemed to understand. But how much longer before the lake took another? Despite Eli's growing fears, Jack remained defiant. You're letting that creepy journal get to you, Jack said one evening, tossing a rock into the lake as they stood by the shore. It's all just old campfire stories, man. You need to chill. Eli shook his head, the weight of the journal still heavy in his mind. Jack, I'm serious. Something's not right. First Ben, now the nightmares, and Sarah. She saw something in the water. Jack rolled his eyes, masking the flicker of fear that crossed his face. Well, I'm not scared. Watch this. Before Eli could stop him, Jack stripped off his shirt and ran into the lake, laughing as the cold water splashed around him. Come on, Eli. It's just water. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. Jack, don't, he shouted. But his words were lost in the night air. Jack swam out farther, the ripples of the lake dark and still around him. For a moment, all was quiet. Too quiet. Then, without warning, Jack screamed. His laughter turned into a sharp, panicked cry as he thrashed wildly in the water. Eli, help! Eli sprinted toward the water's edge, but he froze in horror. Something was dragging Jack down, pulling him under. Jack's arms flailed, desperate for a grip on the surface, but the lake swallowed him, his screams cutting off abruptly. And then, silence. The water smoothed out, calm and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. Eli stood there, numb with terror, staring at the spot where his friend had just vanished. No ripples, no sign of Jack. It was as though the lake had consumed him, leaving nothing behind. He stumbled backward, the realization crashing over him. The lake had taken Jack, and it wasn't finished yet. Eli didn't sleep that night. Jack's screams echoed in his mind, replaying over and over until he couldn't take it anymore. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring out the window toward the lake, which now felt like a living thing, waiting, watching. He couldn't let this continue. The journal had been right. The lake wanted more, and it wasn't going to stop until it had its fill. By the time the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Eli had made up his mind. He pulled on a hoodie, slipped out of the cabin, and walked down the path to the lake. The camp was quiet, the mist hanging low over the water like a veil. It seemed to beckon him, a calm facade masking the darkness beneath. Eli stood at the water's edge, the cool breeze brushing against his face. His thoughts wandered to his brother, his drowning accident that had haunted Eli for years. That same helpless feeling had wrapped itself around him ever since Jack vanished. Maybe this was why he had come to Camp Clearwater. Maybe he had to face this, to confront the lake and, in doing so, confront his own guilt. He stepped into the water, the icy cold biting at his legs as he waded deeper. The weight of his brother's death dragged at him, threatening to pull him under even before the lake could claim him. But as he moved farther into the depths, something else stirred. He could hear faint whispers, voices calling out from beneath the surface. Eli, one voice murmured, soft and familiar. It was Jack. His pulse quickened. He kept walking, the water rising up to his chest. The whispers grew louder, not just Jack's, but others too. And then he heard the voice that made his heart stop. Eli. It was his brother's voice. Eli froze, the water lapping at his shoulders. The weight of his grief crushed him, the years of guilt flooding his senses. But before he could surrender to the lake's pull, he heard another voice, sharp and urgent. Eli. No. It was Sarah, standing at the shoreline. Come back, she screamed, her voice cutting through the fog of whispers. It's not real. For a moment, Eli hesitated, torn between the lake's promises and the living voice calling to him from the shore. The water pulled harder, tugging him down, but then something inside him broke free. It wasn't guilt that was pulling him down. It was fear. Fear of letting go, fear of the truth. With a surge of determination, Eli fought back. He pushed through the icy grip of the lake and swam toward the shore, his muscles aching, his lungs burning. Sarah's voice guided him, and finally, gasping for air, he dragged himself onto the muddy bank. The lake behind him was still, eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. Eli lay on the muddy shore, gasping for breath. His body shook, the cold from the lake seeping deep into his bones. But it wasn't just the chill that made him tremble. It was the realization of what had almost happened. He had nearly given in, nearly let the lake take him. Sarah knelt beside him, her wide eyes filled with concern. Are you okay? She whispered, though she already knew the answer. Eli nodded, but he couldn't find the words to explain what had just happened. He looked out at the lake, its surface as smooth as glass, reflecting the pale morning light. The voices were gone, the pull had faded, but Eli knew the lake wasn't finished. It had let him go this time, but its hunger remained. The camp was silent as the sun rose, the mist slowly lifting from the water. By midday, officials had arrived to search for Jack, though Eli already knew they wouldn't find him. Just like Ben, Jack had been swallowed by the lake, erased without a trace. The camp was closed indefinitely, the authorities chalking up the disappearances to tragic accidents. The counselors packed their bags and left, most of them eager to forget this cursed summer. Eli lingered, standing by the water one last time. The guilt over his brother's death still lingered, but it felt different now, lighter, as if the lake had forced him to confront the darkest parts of himself. As he turned to leave, Sarah stood beside him. It's over now, right? She asked, her voice small. Eli stared at the still, quiet water. A single ripple spread across the lake's surface. Maybe, he said, though deep down, he wasn't sure. As they walked away, the lake remained silent, but Eli knew it was still waiting.